The jobs report came out this week, and we are in an economic boom, but there are some things we need to keep in mind. Venezuela is in chaos, but there are some people in this country that are trying to lead us down that very same road. We'll circle back to some things I didn't get to last week, and then I'm going to nerd out a little. I'm Big E, and this is the Liberty Cast. It was such a packed news week this week. It took me quite a while to figure out what I wanted to address in the time we had together. And I know I'm not going to be able to get into everything, but I'm going to do my best. I'm actually considering extending the show out to 45 minutes or an hour, but that leads to higher production costs and longer prep times and some other considerations. So we'll see. We may do that as we get deeper into the election season. But again, like I said, we'll see what happens. That said, I did want to touch on something I didn't get a chance to address last week. A couple of things, actually. But the biggest one is this.
I'm incredibly proud to have served with him. The thing I'm proudest of is coincidentally, we're each in a different part of the country, and we were each talking to groups of people that were being televised. And at the same day, purely coincidentally, we had asked the question, what are you proudest of in your administration? And you know what I said? It turns out he said the same thing, and probably a little more clearly than I did. Is that not one single whisper of scandal.
Not one.
Not one single whisper of scandal. Not Barack Obama.
That's right.
That's because of Barack.
I know. He's amazing.
Not a whisper of scandal? Is he serious? I mean, on a certain level, I'm actually a bit concerned about him because he is up there in age, but he doesn't think that the DOJ investigating journalists is a scandal. Naming James Rosen, a former Fox News reporter, as an unindicted co-conspirator in a criminal case where all he was doing was his job. Also targeting his parents in that investigation. The Obama Department of Justice collecting work-related and personal phone records of many AP journalists, editors, and other staff. He doesn't think that trading 5 Taliban prisoners for a traitor and a coward named Bo Bergdahl is a scandal. He doesn't think that the IRS targeting conservative groups is a scandal. Fast and Furious, Benghazi, giving $1.5 billion to Iran. None of those episodes are scandals. I mean, I could go on, but obviously you get the idea. Not a whisper of scandal? It makes you wonder, is his age catching up to him? Is he going senile? Does he have some sort of dementia? Or maybe it's just that they don't think any of those things matter.
What difference at this point does it make?
But I guarantee you that if Trump had been in the Oval Office overseeing any of those things, they'd be calling for his impeachment. And frankly, despite what some Twitter trolls would have you believe, I would be too. Because to me, at least 4 of those things rise to the level of treason.
Impeach 45!
Oh yeah, they've been calling for his impeachment pretty much since he took the oath of office. Thank you, Crazy Auntie Max. Okay, moving on to this week. There were a few other things I wanted to touch on from last week with Kamala Harris and Mayor Pete. And if they stay relevant over the coming weeks, maybe we'll revisit some of their nonsense. But until then, like I said, let's just move on. On Friday, the jobs report was released, and we saw some really great numbers. The U3 unemployment rate is at 3.6%, and I'll explain what I mean by U3 here in a second. There were 263,000 jobs added in the month of April. That's nearly 80,000 more than was projected by top economists. And that's 102 straight months of positive job growth. And yes, I know that goes back to the Obama administration, but I framed it that way because the growth that we experienced under Obama, the job growth that we experienced under Obama, was all part-time, low-wage, seasonal jobs. Under President Trump, wages have increased, despite what Hiawatha and the rest of the socialists running for president would have us believe. 3.9% in Q4 of last year, 2.6% in Q1 of this year. Those percentages, in case it wasn't clear, are the amount that the wages have increased over Q4 and Q1 of this year. 5.3 million jobs have been created since President Trump took office. That's something that Obama said could never happen, that his quote-unquote recovery was the new normal. The GDP grew at a 3.2% clip. This is the first time since 2015 where the Q1 GDP was above 3%. So overall, the economy is booming under Trump, something we never experienced under Obama and likely never will experience under any Democrat president. Now, while the economy is booming, everything is humming along, it's not all unicorns and rainbows. We are still spending at an alarming rate. The current national debt is over $22 trillion. Despite the boom that we're in right now, the spending that we're doing is unsustainable. It just is. And if nothing is done to curb it, we're looking at an economic catastrophe. Now, I've talked about this before, but it bears repeating, and it's something that we must let our legislators know is just unacceptable. Now, the Democrats, we all know, have never seen a problem they didn't think they could solve by throwing money at it. Our money. Not their money, our money. And we see how well that works. Just look at education, for example. As a country, we spend more on education than any other country in the world. Yet, according to a Pew Research study, which I'll link to on the website, children in the United States score only slightly above average in science and reading, and slightly below average in math. Countries where children score significantly higher in all three of those categories: Japan, Singapore, which is the number one in all three, Estonia, wherever that is, Germany, New Zealand, and Canada. Canada. Think about, let that sink in. But this isn't about education. I'm getting off on a tangent with that. That's something we can talk about in another show. But this is about out of control spending that nets us nothing. The Trump administration is telling us that the economic growth that we're experiencing will pay for the added debt and deficits in the budget, but that's not true. And as people will try to have you believe, I'm just gonna nod in bovine agreement with whatever the president does, and that's just not true. The administration, the president, is wrong on this. I am not an economist. This is true, but I'm gonna play one here for a minute. There's an economic principle called the Rule of 72. I could go into a detailed explanation of it, but basically it has to do with doubling your investment dollars and how long it would take for that investment to double at a particular interest rate. So if you want to find out how long it would take to double your money at a particular interest rate, you divide that interest rate into 72. So our economy is currently growing at 3%. Simple math tells you that at an average growth rate of 3%, it would take over 23 years to double our economy. So as of right now, our economy is at about $200 trillion. So if we sustain a 3% growth rate, it would take over 23 years for our economy to reach $400 trillion. That's not exactly lighting the world on fire. If we had some people in Washington who actually wanted to see this country prosper, we wouldn't be fighting over tax rates. We wouldn't even be entertaining the notion of Bernie Sanders becoming president. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal would have rendered her a sideshow if she even got elected in the first place. The Speaker of the House would just sit her down, shut her up, and we would never hear from her again if that were the case. But alas, here we are. But if we could sustain a 5% annual GDP growth rate, we could reach that $400 trillion in about 14 years. It would take 7% to double the economy in 10 years. And I know that's unrealistic, but 5% is not impossible if there were some people with some testicular fortitude in Washington who pushed not just pro-growth economic policies, but also kept spending in check. Doubling the economy doesn't mean as much without being responsible with the revenue such an economy would generate. Now, I've talked about this before, but it bears repeating more often than actually I have. But if we continue down this wildly irresponsible spending path, it won't matter how much the economy grows, because the debt is going to reach such a level beyond which we'll be able to recover and will have catastrophic consequences worldwide. And this is easily avoided. If there were some Republicans who supposedly have this reputation for being fiscally responsible, and I haven't seen that on the Republican side for a long time. But if they just can regain some of that fiscal responsibility and implement some wiser spending choices, we can avoid that. We can avoid that scenario altogether. But that does actually dovetail nicely into the next topic I want to talk to you about, and that is Venezuela. Venezuela was once the richest democracy in South America. It was actually a destination for people who wanted to escape dire economic straits. Does that sound familiar? But it was a destination for people who wanted to better their lives, much like the United States is. But Venezuela's been a third world banana republic for a while now. And that is thanks to Hugo Chavez, who is now deceased, and now Nicolas Maduro, who's in place continuing his legacy. But let's take a step back for a second. Chavez came to power after failing to execute a coup. He was jailed and then subsequently pardoned a couple of years later. He built up some political capital, ran for president in 1998, and won. He won by promising the people of Venezuela an end to corruption, an end to poverty, completely revamp the political system and give power to the people, close the income gap, close the wealth gap. Does any of that sound at all familiar?
We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America. In 5 days, you can turn the page on policies that have put greed and irresponsibility on Wall Street before the hard work and sacrifice of folks on Main Street. In 5 days, you can choose policies that invest in our middle class and create new jobs and grow this economy so that everyone has a chance to succeed.
I know he's not in office anymore, but I think you get the idea, especially if you've been listening to me for a while. But the Venezuelan media at the time was largely on board with Chavez's agenda. He orchestrated the passing of a new constitution that gave more power to his office. It abolished one of their legislative chambers. Then he stacked the newly revamped single-party National Assembly with a bunch of his supporters. He also increased the number of judges on their version of the Supreme Court and stacked it with his allies as well. Does that sound familiar? You know, there's been talk of expanding the Supreme Court to 15 or 23 justices and then stacking the court. He also nationalized telecommunications, electric and oil companies. Does any of that sound familiar?
And guess what this liberal would be all about? This liberal will be all about socializing, would be about basically taking over and the government running all of your companies.
It's not really funny, but there's a lot to unpack there. And that won't be the last time you hear that cut, because we're gonna dissect that later on. But Chavez even had his government take over infrastructure projects. Now, in the short term, he was able to close the income gap. These actions, as well as his social missions, won him a lot of support, because free stuff or something. But we're going to take a quick break, and when we get back, I'm going to explain to you how it all went wrong for the Venezuelan people. We'll be right back. So before the break, I laid out for you a lot of the things that Hugo Chavez did when he rose to power, which basically he became a dictator. Not basically, he did. He became a dictator. And what is it that all socialist dictators do? If you said disarm the people, congratulations, you've been paying attention. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, Venezuela never had anything even approaching the Second Amendment. Guns were pretty much always in the hands of either the military or the landed nobility. Civilians and less affluent people could still get their hands on some smaller caliber weapons, but it didn't rise to the level that it does in the United States with our Second Amendment. But when Chavez came to power, he changed all that. He had the Constitution amended to put the army in charge of all firearms. Only the military had the authority to register and control and confiscate, if they deemed necessary, firearms. Under this provision, it was still possible to get a permit to own a handgun, but obviously you had to apply through the military. But then in 2012, shortly before he died in 2013, they imposed a total ban on firearms and ammunition. This was done under the guise of helping control the crime rate, as the banning of firearms is almost always done with some sort of public safety initiative in mind. But as is also always the case, it did nothing of the kind. After the ban on firearms, the murder rate went from 73 per 100,000 people to 92 per 100,000 people. Now let's fast forward to present day. Hugo Chavez is dead. Nicolas Maduro, his hand-picked successor, is in charge. The once vibrant economy is a total disaster. Venezuelans on average have lost about 30 pounds. Inflation is at 73,000%. The currency is less than worthless. There's pictures, if you look, just Google it. There's pictures on the internet of money in piles in the gutters, up and down the streets. People had at one point been eating zoo animals. I'm not even sure if there's any zoo animals left at this point. Now, the United States government is recognizing Juan Guaido as the rightful leader to the country. He was a member of their National Assembly. He's not exactly a conservative. I mean, you don't get to be a member of the National Assembly without being aligned with the leader of that country, whether it was Hugo Chavez or now Nicolas Maduro. It just doesn't happen that way. So not really sure how much better he's going to be in the long run, which is one of many reasons why the United States should not get involved militarily at all in what's going on down there. But that's a whole other story. But he's attempting this coup, and he is calling for the people of Venezuela to rise up and overthrow Maduro. I think this would be a little bit easier with guns, wouldn't it? Now, I'm sure you've seen the videos of the armored cars mowing down civilians, but this is a natural progression of the policy prescriptions that each and every one of the leftists running for president want to implement. I played you that clip a few minutes ago of Maxine Waters in a moment where she let her guard down and let it slip that she wants to nationalize the oil industry. That was a hearing where she was talking to some oil executives who were trying to petition the government for permission to drill and explore for more oil reserves. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal is nothing more than a government takeover of just about every industry disguised as a plan to save the environment. Yeah, she's not running for president yet, but all of the announced candidates have, all of the leftist candidates have expressed support for the plan. Bernie Sanders and Pocahontas, they're focused on income inequality, and All of the rest of them have expressed similar quote-unquote concerns. Every last one of them wants to limit and control what you can and can't say, what you should and shouldn't think, and take your guns away. If they manage to get your guns, it's going to be a hell of a lot easier for them to force you to say and think what they want. And if they were to somehow manage that, all of the rest of their utopian dream dominoes would fall right into place, which would open the door for a guy like Barack Obama, who once famously lamented being constrained by the Constitution, to come in and take over in Chavez-like fashion. You think I'm crazy? You think that's far-fetched? Just pay attention to what they're saying. What you're seeing happening in Venezuela right now is the inevitable consequence of a government like the one that all of the 73 leftists that are running for president are proposing. Is it 73? I can't keep track anymore. They're coming out of the woodwork left and right. But each and every one of them are proposing policies that will lead to the exact same thing happening here that is happening in Venezuela right now. Of course, they think they're smarter than everyone else who's tried it before. They think they can do it without causing 73,000% inflation. They think they can feed everyone. They think that they're smarter than every other communist dictator and can implement these policies, and everything is going to work out great. But let's be honest, most of these people are stupid. I mean, have you heard some of them speak? Alexandria Ocasio, I just discovered agriculture and I'm shook, Cortez. Eric Newcomb Swalwell. Bernie, being a millionaire is not the American dream, Sanders. Kamala, I smoked weed listening to rappers who hadn't even put out a record yet, Harris. And the list goes on. I wonder if some of them are even smart enough to tie their own shoes sometimes, because they come up with some of the most ridiculous nonsense. Now, I'm exaggerating. Yes, some of them are intellectually, or should I say, academically accomplished, maybe, but they have no common sense and no intellectual honesty whatsoever. Okay, you know what? We're going to take another quick break, and when we get back, I think we're going to nerd out a little bit. And may the 4th be with you, and we'll see you on the other side. I told you I was a nerd. Don't judge me. Even if this is your first time listening to the show, by now you understand that I am a huge comic book nerd.
Nerd alert!
But I'm also a big Game of Thrones fan. Now, I started to read the books when the show first came out seven years ago. I'm generally a fast reader, and I figured I could get through at least the first book and then slog through the rest as the seasons progressed. But they are a tough, tough read. I'd like to read the books at some point because there's so much left out of the show that you could do a whole other show with a whole other series of shows with what they left out. But what I really wanted to talk about was the episode of Game of Thrones last Sunday. I know it's late. I'm sure if you watch the show, you've already discussed it, but I haven't. So here's my take on it. My wife and I watched the show. We've been watching it since the beginning. By the way, this is going to have some spoilers. If you haven't watched it, it's been a week. I'm sorry about your bad luck, but spoilers ahead. Despite the fact that this episode was so dark, it was still one of my favorite episodes from all seasons because Arya Stark is one of my absolute favorite characters. She has been almost since the beginning. And we've seen her grow up from a little kid to be this one of the fiercest warriors on the show. And this episode was a huge battle. Very dark, hard to see, but you saw her. And everything that she's gone through up to now has been leading her to this moment and perhaps another one later on. We'll see how it plays out. But definitely up to this moment. And she's in battle. She's actually hurt for the first time. She's stunned. She's figuring out how to cope with that type of adversity in battle because she's always been so much better than everyone that she's fought. But then she gets a pep talk of sorts from someone who actually was on her list to dispatch. And you can kind of understand exactly what I mean by that. And then she runs off. And the next time you see her, she's flying through the air with a dagger in her hand, about to kill the bad guy. The bad guy knows she's coming, turns around, catches her. Now, part of what makes her so fierce is that she's really small. She's a small girl. But after he catches her by the neck, she drops the dagger into her offhand and stabs him with it. Hashtag not today. I looked at my wife. My jaw was dropped on the floor. That whole scene was just amazing. Even though, like I said, it was dark, it was incredible. Absolutely incredible. And I'm actually going to watch it again before the next episode because it was that badass. So if you're not a Game of Thrones fan, you probably should be. But before we get you out of here, I have to nerd out a little bit more and talk about Avengers Endgame again. I haven't seen it again yet, but it's such a good movie. I've been thinking about it, talking about it with friends and stuff like that. If you take Avengers Endgame and Infinity War and put them together, much like a lot of people do with The Godfather Part 1 and 2, I'm not comparing the two. Trust me, I'm not. Just to say that if you take them as a unit, like you do with Godfather 1 and 2, it is perhaps my favorite MCU movie experience out of all of the MCU movies to date. But why is that? I mean, this is its second weekend, and even though the official numbers are not out yet as of this recording, but it has probably already topped $2 billion. If it hasn't done it yet, it will by the end of the weekend. It's already the third highest grossing movie at the international box office ever. And by the time you listen to this, it could be past Titanic for the number 2 spot. At this point, it has a legit shot to replace Avatar as the highest grossing movie ever. And also, it could hit $3 billion. Now, why am I talking about this again? A movie doesn't make this much money this quickly without having an impact on society at large. It's a cultural phenomenon. And there are some lines in the movie that I think are already in the vernacular. I'm not going to say what they are. I'm not going to give that away just yet. But the reason why it's had this kind of impact is it's not just all action all the time. There are some amazing action sequences. There's a lot of fan service and payoffs from previous movies. But it also deals with how the main characters deal with tragedy and loss. And it really takes you on an emotional roller coaster. Some of the best parts of the movie are actually just characters talking to each other and working through the ramifications of the snapshot in Infinity War, as well as some of the things that take place in this movie. Now, obviously, the last act of the movie has some truly, truly iconic action moments. But as I said, also some very impactful emotional moments. And in fact, the same could be said for Game of Thrones, which is why it too is such a cultural phenomenon. Now, unlike some conservative commentators, and I'm not going to name them because I don't know them, but I listen to them and I read their work, and they have some huge problems with Game of Thrones and Endgame. I do not look for these movies to have any sort of larger implications in my life. When I go to these movies, I want to sit for 2 or 3 hours and just be entertained. That's it. Entertain me. I don't want to think about what it's going to teach me. I don't want to think about how it's an allegory for this or that. I don't care. If it is, great. I don't care. I just want to be entertained. And that's what this show and this movie does for me. And I hope it does for you too. And I hope that if you have not seen it yet, you take what I'm saying about it and go check it out. Go see Endgame, or sit down on Sunday night and watch Game of Thrones. Well, no, don't do that. If you haven't watched Game of Thrones, don't do that. Go back to the beginning and watch it from the beginning, and then you'll understand. All right, y'all. I went way over on the nerd out. So that's our show. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe, leave a review. You can find us on iTunes, Spreaker, anywhere you get your podcasts. You can also follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. It's at The Liberty Cast on all 3 platforms. Again, thanks for listening. And as usual, keep your head on a swivel and stay safe, everybody.